The basement of the courthouse was not meant to be remembered. Most people never knew it existed. Those who did preferred not to talk about it. It sat beneath the oldest wing of the building, below the marble, below the portraits, below the flags and seals and ideals carved into stone. A narrow stairwell led down into a space that smelled of paper, iron, and something older, something damp, the kind of smell that lingers long after everyone responsible is gone. The lights flickered when they were switched on. They always did. No one could remember when the wiring had last been replaced. Pause. The boxes were stacked against the far wall, untouched, unlabeled. No inventory tags, no dates, no signatures, just dust. At first glance, they looked like what they were supposed to be: excess records, misfiled documents, the administrative debris of a century that didn't bother cleaning up after itself. That assumption lasted less than 5 minutes, because inside the first box, beneath brittle folders and curled parchment, were certificates, death certificates. Not unusual on their own. Courthouses archive death records all the time. But these were different. Voice slightly lower. 43 of them, all written in the same hand, all dated within a narrow span of years, all bearing official seals that were no longer in use, and all, without exception, listed the same cause of death, a phrase that no longer exists in modern law, a phrase that should not have been repeated this many times. Pause. The man who found them was not a historian, not an archivist, not even a senior official. He was a judge, young, newly appointed, still idealistic enough to believe that the law, when followed carefully, eventually corrected itself. He had come down to the basement looking for a property ledger. Instead, he found a pattern. At first, he didn't know what he was looking at. He sorted the papers slowly, carefully, like someone afraid the documents might break if handled too roughly. Names, dates, witness signatures. Then the locations started repeating. Same rural district, same court jurisdiction, same 3 surnames appearing again and again, not as the deceased, but as witnesses. That was the first unease. Silence. Judges are trained to notice patterns. It's part of the job. And this pattern was wrong. The ages didn't make sense. Some of the deceased were listed as children, others as adults, but with identical phrasing, identical language, identical causes. No variations, no explanations, as if whoever wrote these had copied the words deliberately or had been instructed not to change them. Voice barely tighter. The judge checked the registry upstairs. None of the deaths appeared there. No cross-references, no burial permits, no estate proceedings. 43 people had died, officially, and yet legally it was as if they had never existed. That's when the room felt colder. Not traumatically, not suddenly, just wrong. He told himself there had to be an explanation, a clerical error, a batch of documents filed incorrectly, a jurisdictional quirk from a less organized time. That belief held right up until he noticed the dates. The earliest certificate predated the courthouse itself. The latest was signed nearly 20 years after the supposed practice had been abolished. Voice drops. That should not have been possible. Before we go any further, pause with me for a moment. Tell me where you're listening from. The North? The South? Outside the United States? Because these records didn't stay where they were written, and the consequences of what they describe didn't respect borders either. Leave a comment. I read them. Now, let's go back downstairs. The judge did not report the discovery immediately, not because he intended to hide it, but because he wanted to understand it first. He took the certificates home, photocopies only, and began comparing them against old statutes, defunct legal codes, and regional court customs that hadn't been taught in law school. That's when he found the phrase, a legal term once used quietly, briefly, and then erased. It referred to a category of death that was convenient, not criminal, not natural, not accidental, something in between. A classification designed to close cases without trials, to end questions before they were asked, and most disturbingly, it required approval. Approval from a judge, from someone sitting exactly where he now sat. That realization changed the nature of the discovery. This was not a mistake, it was a system, a small one, a localized one, but precise. The certificates weren't sloppily written, they were carefully prepared. Each bore correct seals for its time period. Each listed witnesses whose names aligned with real officials, men who had existed, served, and retired with clean public records, men remembered as respectable. And yet 43 deaths had passed through their hands and vanished. The judge began mapping the names. He placed them on a timeline, then on a hand-drawn map of the county. The dots formed a shape, not a perfect one, but close enough to suggest intent. Every death occurred within walking distance of a single road, a road that no longer existed. It had been swallowed by farmland, subdivided, renamed. But in the period the certificates covered, it led to somewhere specific, to a property, one that appeared in no tax records for nearly 30 years. There was no dramatic reaction, no slammed desk, no shouted realization, just a long moment where the judge sat still and understood that if he was right, someone used the law not just to conceal deaths, but to make them untraceable. The basement boxes hadn't been forgotten, they had been placed, left long enough for memory to decay around them. That night, the judge locked the courthouse himself. He didn't tell his clerk what he'd found. He didn't file a memo. Instead, he wrote a single question in his notebook. How many more are missing that were never certified at all? Because systems that produce 43 documents rarely stop at 43 victims. And somewhere, beneath the weight of official seals and polite language, a truth waited. One that would not stay buried much longer.
The mind looks for order before it accepts horror. The judge knew this. He welcomed it. After days of documents and unanswered questions, he needed an explanation that fit inside the world he understood, a world governed by precedent, procedure, and probability. And one presented itself almost immediately. Midwives. In the rural South of the 19th century, midwives occupied a strange legal space. They were essential, respected, and largely unregulated. Births happened at home. Deaths happened quietly. Paperwork, when it existed at all, was often retrospective. A child could be born and buried without ever touching official record. That theory smoothed the edges. If the 43 certificates referred to stillbirths, if the language was euphemistic rather than literal, if the cause of death phrase was a legal shorthand now lost to time, then the system didn't have to be sinister, just outdated. Negligent, perhaps, but not malicious. That explanation would account for the ages, the repetition, even the absence of burial permits. It would also explain why witnesses were reused. Midwives often worked with the same physicians, the same local officials. The judge wrote the theory down. For the first time since the basement, his pen moved easily. But theories don't survive contact with geography. The map still bothered him. So did the road, and the property it led to. He decided to visit it. Not officially, not yet. The land was still there, though the name had changed. Once it had been a plantation, not a famous one, not large enough to appear in textbooks, just substantial enough to matter. By the time the judge arrived, the original house had been remodeled, columns replaced, windows widened, a wraparound porch added for charm, history repackaged. The current owner was proud of the place. He gave tours on weekends, spoke about restoration, pointed out the age of the beams, the imported brick, the lineage of the land. He also mentioned the colonel, always the colonel, a man remembered as firm but fair, a veteran, a local magistrate, a respected landholder. The judge asked, casually, about old records, about births, deaths. The owner shrugged. Records were spotty back then, everyone knew that. So the judge asked to see the outbuildings. They were gone, replaced by guest cottages and manicured paths. Only one structure remained from the period in question, a small, low building at the edge of the property. The owner referred to it as a storage shed. It had no windows. The colonel, according to local legend, had used it for private matters, disputes, records, occasionally housing travelers. The explanation felt vague, but not alarming, not yet. Inside, the air was cooler. The walls were thicker than necessary. The floor had been replaced. The judge noticed this without knowing why it mattered. Over tea, the owner shared a story. The colonel had been known for settling things quietly. He disliked scandal. He believed community order was fragile. Sometimes people came to him with problems they didn't want public: unwanted pregnancies, illegitimate children, family embarrassments. The colonel helped. That was the word used. Helped arrange things, helped relocate people, helped make problems manageable. The judge felt relief. This fit. It explained the lack of trials, the reused witnesses, the uniform language. Discretion had been valued more than transparency. Not admirable by modern standards, but not monstrous either. The judge left the property calmer than he had arrived. The theory held. It was reasonable. He told himself that history often looks darker when stripped of context, that it was dangerous to impose modern morality on older systems. For the first time, he considered closing the matter quietly, archiving the certificates properly, adding annotations, letting the dead stay dead. That night he slept, not well, but better, until he woke with a thought he hadn't had before, a simple one. If these were midwife-related deaths, why were there no birth records at all? No maternal names, no fathers, no dates of delivery, only death. And why? Why did every certificate list the same location? Not home, not residence, but on-site. That phrase had no reason to exist in birth documentation, none at all. The reasonable explanation began to crack, just slightly, not enough to panic, enough to listen more closely. Because explanations that feel comforting are often designed to be, and sometimes they are offered by people who know exactly what you want to hear.
The problem with reasonable explanations is that they require cooperation. Not belief, not trust, just cooperation from the facts. The judge returned to the courthouse with a single intention: to verify, to place the certificates into context and move on. That was still the plan. He requested access to the oldest financial ledgers, not death records, not court rulings, money. Because money, unlike memory, rarely lies for long. The ledgers were heavy, hand-bound, their spines cracked when opened. They recorded expenses for the county going back further than the certificates: paper, ink, transport fees, modest stipends paid to clerks and contractors,
and something else. Regular payments. Not large, not small, just consistent. Every few months over the same span of years as the 43 deaths. The recipient line was abbreviated, a single initial, followed by the word services. Midwives were paid per birth, per visit. These payments were not. They arrived whether a death was recorded or not. Sometimes twice in the same month, sometimes following weeks with no recorded events at all. The judge copied the entries by hand. Side by side, he placed them next to the death certificates. That was when the timeline failed. 3 of the certificates were dated after the final payment. 4 were dated before the first. If these deaths were connected to midwifery services, the ledger should have aligned. It didn't, not even loosely. The judge marked the discrepancies in pencil, then erased them, then marked them again. The pattern remained. He broadened the search. Birth registries, church baptism logs, estate transfers, and slowly another distinction emerged. 2 kinds of records. One set, the public ones, were inconsistent, fragmented, filled with gaps that could be explained by war, decay, or neglect. The other set, the internal records, were meticulous. Clean handwriting, regular intervals, consistent terminology. The death certificates belonged to the second category. They had been maintained with care. That alone was troubling. Midwives didn't file documents like this. Neither did physicians working informally. But courts did. So did plantations, institutions that understood documentation as power. The judge noticed something else. The language of the certificates changed over time. Not the cause of death, the phrasing around it. Early documents used formal legal constructions. Later ones simplified them, as if the writer had grown more confident or less concerned about scrutiny. The signatures followed the same progression. Early, elaborate. Later, rushed. This was not chaos. It was evolution. The judge returned to the map. He added the ledger payments, then overlaid the certificates again. The shape became clearer. The road, the property, and a secondary location, smaller but repeated. A crossing point near a creek, the kind of place carts could stop without being seen from the main road. Childbirth does not require secrecy, but removal does. The final crack came with a name. One of the 43 appeared twice. Same spelling, same witness, 2 different dates, 6 years apart. No human being had died twice. The judge stared at the paper longer than he should have. Then he realized the truth. The certificates were not records of death. They were permissions, authorizations, documents created before something happened, then finalized after. That was why there were no birth records, why the cause of death never varied, why the witnesses repeated. These were not reports, they were instruments, and the colonel had not been helping people manage problems. He had been managing inventory. The reasonable explanation did not collapse dramatically. It simply stopped working. And once it did, there was no version of events left that did not involve intent, structure, and a number that was almost certainly incomplete. The judge closed the ledger. For the first time since the basement, he understood that he was not uncovering forgotten history. He was interrupting a process that once was routine. And routines, when exposed, reveal what they were built to hide. The judge did not go looking for her. That mattered. He had followed documents, names, dates. Her name appeared the way all the others did, typed once, handwritten once, then never again. Sarah. No surname. That alone made her unusual. Most of the 43 were listed by full name, even when other details were absent. Sarah stood alone. The judge located her through a church ledger, a baptism record, out of sequence, entered years after the fact. 2 children, same mother, no father listed, both baptized on the same day. That rarely happened. The church still stood, smaller now, repainted, air-conditioned, but the pastor remembered. Not Sarah directly, but the way people spoke about her. She kept quiet. That was her strength. She knew when not to answer. The judge asked if she was still alive. The pastor nodded. "She is," he said, "as far as I know." Sarah lived less than 10 miles from the old property, in a house that had been repaired many times but never improved. The judge didn't bring documents. He didn't bring questions prepared in advance. He brought time. She opened the door slowly, not startled, not afraid, just cautious. The judge introduced himself. She studied his face for a moment longer than politeness required. Then she said something he had not expected. "The records say I am." Silence. He asked her what she meant. She motioned for him to sit. They spoke in fragments at first, about the weather, about the road closures, about nothing that mattered. Then, without being asked, she said it again. "The records say I am dead." She was 17 when she was taken to the property. Not alone. There were others, some older, some younger. No one used the word prison. They didn't have to. She said the colonel was polite. That detail hurt more than cruelty would have. He spoke softly, used names, explained things as if they were necessary, as if they were for the good of everyone involved. She gave birth twice. Both times the children were taken. Not immediately. She was allowed to hold them, long enough to learn their faces, long enough to understand what would be lost. Years later, they were returned, not as infants, as children, older, quieter. They had learned not to ask questions. The judge asked how. She looked at him, not with anger, but with calculation. "Someone changed their mind," she said. She did not elaborate. She never described violence. That absence was deliberate. Instead, she spoke about waiting, about silence, about learning which questions made things worse. She said silence was the only thing they couldn't take from her, so she kept it. The judge asked her why she had agreed to speak now. She thought about it, then said, "Because you already know." He asked if she knew how many there were. She shook her head. "More than me," she said, "less than they planned." Before he left, he told her one more thing. When her death certificate had been signed, she was alive, standing in the room next to where it was written. She had been told it was necessary, a kindness, a way to protect her children from something worse. The judge did not ask what that something was. Some answers don't need to be spoken to be understood. When he returned to his car, he sat without starting it. The system he had uncovered now had a face, a voice, and proof that the certificates did not mark endings, they marked transitions, erasure. Sarah had survived by being unrecorded, by letting the paperwork lie. And now, the paperwork had found her again.
After Sarah, the judge stopped pretending he was documenting history. He was counting damage.
He returned to the certificates, not to understand how they worked anymore, but who they erased. This time he began with the women. He cross-referenced the 43 names against every available birth and death index in the region. County ledgers, church burial books, family registries kept by hand in the backs of Bibles. Patterns emerged quickly, too quickly. Women listed as having died in childbirth, whose deaths coincided precisely with births recorded elsewhere. Same dates, same locations, different names. The deaths made sense only if you believed the babies had not survived, but the babies had. They appeared later, sometimes miles away, sometimes under new surnames, officially born to other women, women who had no pregnancy records, no midwife payments, no physical recovery noted, just a child. The judge separated the records into two piles. On one side, women who vanished after childbirth. On the other, infants who appeared without origin. The overlap was undeniable. Every reassigned child corresponded to a dead mother, a mother who, in at least 3 cases, had been seen alive months later, before disappearing again. The cause of death on the certificates was always the same, a phrase that implied inevitability, as if the law itself had decided these women were expendable. The judge now understood the structure. If a woman died in childbirth, there were questions, doctors, neighbors, funerals. But if she legally died, if the paperwork said so, then her child became unclaimed property, and unclaimed property could be reassigned. The colonel's role sharpened into focus. He wasn't arranging discretion. He was redistributing lives. Children placed with families who could not or would not ask where they came from. Families with influence, with land, with reasons to want heirs without scandal. And the mothers? The mothers became ghosts. Some were relocated, some were silenced by distance, some never reappeared in any record at all. The judge stopped short of writing the word murder, not because it was inaccurate, but because the law of that era would not have recognized it as such. This was not violence as chaos, it was violence as administration.
If this story is affecting you, pause for a moment. Tap like if you believe history matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Subscribe if you want these stories told carefully, not sensationally. And leave a comment. Do you think systems like this disappear or just change their shape? I read every response. The judge found one case that broke his composure. A woman listed as dying during her 3rd childbirth. 3 certificates, 3 children. Only 2 appeared later in reassignment records. The 3rd did not. No baptism, no adoption, nothing. The judge followed the trail as far as it went. It ended near the creek, the same crossing point marked on the map, the place carts could stop unseen, where no ledger required explanation. The realization came quietly. Some babies were not reassigned. They were disposed of. The horror did not arrive as shock. It arrived as confirmation. Every reasonable doubt had been used up. What remained was a system that sorted women into 2 categories: those who could be erased quietly, and those whose children were valuable enough to keep. The judge closed the final ledger with care, as if it might bruise. The death certificates were never about death. They were about transfer, about ownership. And once that truth surfaced, there was no way to pretend the story was about paperwork ever again. It was about bodies, and choices made by people who believed the law would protect them forever. The judge stopped looking at deaths. He started looking at purchases, because systems that hide people still have to pay for them. The financial ledgers he'd already reviewed showed regular payments, but now he expanded the scope. Plantation account books, private estate expenses, records not meant for courts, but for owners. Livestock, tools, food, and then entries that didn't belong anywhere else. Domestic acquisition, temporary labor, special transport. The wording shifted over time, but the structure remained. Each entry was followed by a gap. Then, months later, a death certificate. The judge aligned the dates. The pattern emerged cleanly. Girls were purchased or transferred in when pregnant, not visibly so at first, early enough to pass unnoticed. Their ages clustered tightly: 14, 15, 16, rarely older than 18, never younger than 13. This was not incidental. It was selection. The timeline was precise: arrival, isolation, birth, then, within weeks or months, a legal death. Always after the child was old enough to survive separation, never before. The judge cross-referenced the girls' names, when names existed at all. Some appeared in slave sale records, others in indenture agreements, a few in orphan transfer logs. Different systems, same destination. The colonel had not relied on one source. He had diversified. The death certificates now made sense in a way that felt unbearable. They were issued only when the asset, the child, had been secured. The mother's legal death finalized the transaction, freed the child from origin, freed the buyer from questions. Money moved accordingly. Families receiving children made donations, not directly, never traceable. Improvements to roads, endowments to churches, legal favors returned quietly years later. The judge tracked 3 such families across generations, prominent names, philanthropic legacies. Each had received at least one child whose birth did not align with any pregnancy record. The motive was no longer theoretical. Children were valuable. Heirs without scandal, labor without lineage, bodies that could be reshaped into legitimacy. And the mothers? The mothers were liabilities. They knew too much. They could claim too much. They could speak. So they were erased on paper, and once erased, their absence became permanent. The judge found one ledger entry that ended any remaining doubt. A payment labeled simply adjustment, dated 2 days before a death certificate. No service listed, no recipient named, just an amount equal to the cost of transporting a body. Silence. The colonel had not been improvising. He had optimized, reduced variables, standardized outcomes. This was not a series of crimes. It was a workflow. The judge closed the book slowly. His hands were steady. That frightened him, because steadiness meant acceptance, and acceptance was the most dangerous stage of understanding. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer tell yourself it was rare, or accidental, or a product of its time. It was deliberate, it was profitable, and it required the cooperation of people who knew exactly what they were participating in. Silence. The buying pattern did not explain everything, but it explained enough. Enough to know that the story was larger than one plantation, larger than one judge, and far larger than 43 certificates. The judge did not expect doctors. He should have.
Systems that erase people rarely operate without medical cooperation. The first reference appeared in correspondence, not court files, private letters, folded, sealed, never mailed. They had been kept in a locked drawer inside a desk that no one had opened in decades. The name appeared repeatedly. Dr. Cross. No first name, just a signature, confident, unadorned. The letters were not incriminating on their own. They were practical. Notes about timing, instructions on recovery, requests for discretion. One phrase appeared again and again. Per our usual arrangement. No explanation followed. None was necessary. Dr. Cross was not listed in the county physician registry, but his name appeared in medical supply orders, surgical tools, anesthetics, antiseptics, ordered in quantities far exceeding local need. The judge traced the shipments. They did not stop at the plantation. They radiated outward, to neighboring counties, across state lines. One delivery log listed 6 destinations in 3 states. Same physician name, same supplier, different plantations, different jurisdictions, same timing relative to recorded deaths. The implication was unavoidable. This was not a local operation. It was a network. Dr. Cross's letters described procedures in detached language. No names, no genders, no ages, only outcomes. Complication managed, recovery satisfactory, disposition completed. In one letter, the doctor apologized for a delay. Weather had made transport difficult. The child had to remain on site longer than preferred. The phrase "the child" appeared nowhere else. That detail mattered, because doctors do not usually reference stillbirths this way. But assets, those require monitoring. Dr. Cross identified 3 other physicians using similar phrasing. Different handwriting, same vocabulary. They referenced Dr. Cross with deference, asked for guidance, confirmed compliance. One referred to him as the senior, another thanked him for introducing the arrangement to their region. Medical licensure records showed nothing unusual. Each physician had practiced legitimately, served on boards, delivered babies, treated the poor. Their public reputations were clean. Their private correspondence was efficient. The judge mapped the deaths again. This time he added physician roots. The lines overlapped. Children moved one direction. Mothers disappeared another. Paperwork flowed upward. Money flowed sideways. The colonel had not invented the system. He had participated in it. Dr. Cross had not operated alone. He had coordinated. And the judges who signed the certificates, they had legitimized. This was not an isolated corruption. It was a supply chain, each part small enough to deny responsibility, each essential. The most disturbing realization came last. If this network crossed state lines, then no single court had ever had full jurisdiction, which meant no single authority had ever been able or willing to stop it. The law had not failed. It had been used exactly as designed. By the time the judge finished assembling the evidence, there was no ambiguity left. Not morally, not procedurally, only legally. He built the case the way he had been trained to, methodically, defensively, assuming resistance at every turn. Certificates, ledgers, correspondence. He created timelines that showed intent, maps that showed coordination, witness chains that linked physicians, officials, and beneficiaries. Every document corroborated another. No single piece proved everything. Together, they were overwhelming. He prepared indictments, not one, several. Conspiracy, fraud,
abuse of authority, unlawful transfer of persons. He avoided words the era would not recognize. He framed everything in the language of property law, contract violations, and misrepresentation. If justice was going to happen, it would have to enter through narrow doors. Then the colonel died, quietly, in his sleep. The obituary was respectful. It mentioned his service, his generosity, his devotion to order. Nothing about the property, nothing about the road, nothing about the certificates. With his death, the center of the case vanished, not emotionally, legally. The colonel had signed many documents, but rarely alone. Responsibility diffused outward, to clerks, to physicians, to judges now deceased themselves. Each defense argument was predictable. I followed custom. I relied on authority. I believed the paperwork was valid. But the judge pressed forward anyway. He presented the case internally, then formally, then, when resistance surfaced, quietly. He was told the evidence was compelling. He was also told it was complicated, too old, too fragmented, too dangerous. Dangerous to whom was never specified. Statutes of limitation were invoked, jurisdictional conflicts raised, witnesses unavailable, records incomplete. Each objection, taken alone, sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a wall. The final blow came from the same place the system had always relied on: discretion. The recommendation was not written, it was spoken. This would reopen too many settled matters, cast doubt on too many families, undermine trust in institutions no longer capable of defending themselves. The past, the judge was told, had already decided. The trial that never happened was not a failure of proof. It was a choice, made collectively, quietly. And once made, it became precedent. It began quietly, too quietly for anyone to notice at first. Sarah's name appeared on a ledger faded at the edges, typed, not handwritten, the faintest whisper of her existence reduced to an entry, available, transferable. The stranger arrived in town the same week. He was not remarkable, not frightening, just a man with eyes trained to read opportunity. He studied the list carefully. He paused at one name, Sarah. He smiled, almost politely, and made a note. Bids began to escalate, quiet at first. A few coins here, a ledger scribble there, each offer larger than the last. No one in town spoke aloud. No one dared, except one woman, the widow. Her presence was sudden, her arrival purposeful. She had known the rules, and she had known the loopholes. Pause. Emphasis. She intervened. Not with force, not with violence, with knowledge, with the power to disrupt what the ledger had set in motion. She challenged the bids, she questioned the stranger, she invoked the faintest legal precedent, the sort buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Slow, suspenseful, almost a whisper. Sarah listened. Her children clung to her. They did not understand the danger fully, only that her voice had changed, that the ledger had moved, that strangers could now wield what was once hidden. Tension rises. The ripple began. One ledger entry, one stranger, one intervention, and suddenly the past collided with the present. The consequences of choices made decades before, of trials that never happened, could no longer remain buried. The children, now adults themselves, would soon face the truth that was never meant to reach them. Pause, then quiet, deliberate, and some of that truth would come for them first.
Freedom. A word that had been promised, a word that had been written into law, a word that now lay in the hands of those who had lived without it. Manumission. The legal papers were precise. Stamps, signatures, dates, a bureaucratic promise. Yet as Sarah and the others held them, it felt almost hollow. The ink was dry, the parchment thin, but the ledger, that cold record of transactions, still pressed against their hearts. For years, the children, now adults, had lived in shadows, a shadow cast by an invisible hand. Names crossed out, reassigned, moved from one ledger page to another. The ledger had dictated their lives long before they understood its meaning. Now the law said they were free. But freedom without truth is a fragile thing. Sarah traced the faded ink with her finger, a ledger entry here, a date there. Each name remembered, each one a ghost. The girls taken too young, the mothers who never returned, the men who had orchestrated it all, gone without consequence. Freedom had arrived, yet justice remained absent. No trial had held the colonels accountable. No court had listened to the whispers of midwives or the testimonies buried under decades of secrecy. No ledger-burning moment had set the record straight. Instead, the ledger remained, its cold permanence a reminder that some truths cannot be erased, only remembered. Sarah's purpose shifted. Survival had once been her only guide. Now it was memory. Now it was naming. She spoke aloud, softly at first. Names she had never thought she would utter. Names of children bought, sold, reassigned. Names of mothers who died in silence. The ledger had kept them apart, but memory would reunite them. Each adult held the weight differently. Some shook with anger, barely able to hold the pages. Some wept quietly, mourning not just what they had lost, but what the law had never returned. Some simply stared, silent, feeling the ledger's shadow still touch them. Freedom was theirs, yes, but it did not heal. It did not absolve. It did not replace lost childhoods, stolen families, or the love that had never been given. The ledger had been a tool of control, a record of ownership, not of lives lived. Now that ownership was gone, but the ledger's memory remained, a truth that would ripple through generations. Sarah looked out the window, the first sunlight of the day spilling over the horizon. She saw more than light. She saw names, faces, moments she could never reclaim, but could bear witness to. And in that moment, she understood. Freedom was not a gift, it was a responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to speak, to ensure the ledger's victims were never forgotten. Justice had not followed. The ledger had not been erased. The men who orchestrated these lives had passed without reckoning. But memory could not be bought. It could not be sold. It could not be stolen. And in remembering, the ledger began to lose its power. Freedom had arrived, yet the ledger's shadow lingered, its imprint on their souls permanent. its lessons harsh but necessary. And so, they walked forward into a world that the law had given them, but not yet one that had been set right.
Even after freedom, the ledger haunted those who survived, not in the form of threats or punishments, but in questions that refused to be answered. Questions with no signatures, no stamps, no proof of existence. Questions that moved like ghosts through the lives of those who had been bought, sold, or reassigned. The fathers. Almost none of their names appear in the records. Some were strangers, some were neighbors, some perhaps men who had promised care or protection and then vanished, leaving children to be catalogued as property. And the ledger, for all its bureaucratic precision, revealed the deliberate cruelty of omission. Missing pages, overwritten entries, dates that could not align, each gap a silent indictment, each smudge of ink a reminder of what someone had hoped would disappear forever. Burned journals told another story, smoke-stained, ash-swept, confessions scrawled in trembling hands, notes from midwives who knew too much, household records that had been destroyed, whether by fear, shame, or intent. The stranger. The figure glimpsed once, maybe twice, the shadow in auction rooms, a man who signed names into existence or erased them. Every note, every marginal comment reflected control and obsession. Paperwork as weapon, paperwork as erasure. Even now, decades later, the ledger continues to haunt. It is not just ink on paper, it is a timeline of suffering, hidden behind columns and rows, a record of what the law allowed, what society ignored, and what memory struggled to preserve. And yet, there are still gaps, unspoken names, faces lost to time, truths that never reached a court, a diary, or even the whispers of those who survived. Sarah and the others reclaimed their freedom, yes, but the ledger, burned journals, and missing pages were a constant reminder: history is never fully owned. Some truths are kept by absence, some by silence, some by the careful folding of paper, the erasure of ink, the shadows of those who refused to testify. And the ledger, it is not just a record, it is a mirror. It reflects the cruelty that bureaucracies allow. It reflects the pain that laws cannot prevent. It reflects a world that, if we are not careful, will always repeat its mistakes. Even now there are records we have not found, files untouched in forgotten archives, letters that await eyes brave enough to read them, names waiting for voices willing to speak them. Perhaps, if we search carefully, if we question, probe, and confront the shadows of history, the ledger's final secrets may yet emerge. Perhaps, if we search carefully, if we question, probe, and confront the shadows of history, the ledger's final secrets may yet emerge. We can reclaim some of what was hidden. We can name the nameless. We can remember the forgotten. But freedom does not erase history. It only gives us the chance to see it clearly. And that is the most terrifying truth of all. Even when we look, even when we think we understand, there are still stories we cannot see. Stories folded in smoke, ink, and silence. Stories waiting for someone with courage to uncover them. And maybe, just maybe, if we do not look carefully enough, history will hide its lessons again. If stories like this matter, join us in uncovering the hidden past. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video so others can see what history tried to hide. Comment below, which part of this story shocked you the most? Do you think there are still secrets waiting in records we've never found? Let us know where you're watching from, north, south, or somewhere beyond the U.S., because these stories crossed borders, and so did their consequences. The ledger may be silent, The journals may be burned, the fathers may never be known, but memory, the courage to uncover it, and the act of witnessing, these are lights that no paper can ever extinguish.